My stepmom falsely accused me of pushing her down the stairs at her baby shower, turning my family against me, and now my dad wants my help for free. Hi, I'm a 24-year-old woman just starting my career as a lawyer. Recently, my father asked me to assist him with something, but I had to turn him down. Now my family is upset with me for that decision. A few months ago, my father severed ties with me, accusing me of being mentally unstable and jealous over something I didn't even do. I never started any of the arguments, but somehow, it always ended up being my fault. It felt incredibly unfair, but I had no choice but to endure it because I didn't have anyone to turn to. My mother had been out of the picture for years, having given up her parental rights when I was very young. My father had been the only parent I knew even before Julia came into our lives. He had a few girlfriends before her, but they were all kind to me. Unfortunately, he never got serious with any of them, so none of those relationships lasted. The situation began when my stepmother, who I genuinely believed to be the worst person I know, accused me of pushing her down the stairs during her baby shower when she was pregnant. To this day, I have no idea why she made such a serious accusation. My best guess is that she simply harbors a deep-seated hatred towards me and wanted to manipulate others into feeling the same way. Sadly, her plan worked and she succeeded in turning my father against me. Though, if I'm being entirely honest, I can't say that I didn't make it easier for her by occasionally clashing with her behavior. My stepmom, Julia, who's 40, married my dad, who's 48, 10 years ago after they had dated for 2 years. So I've known her for nearly 12 years now. From the very start, Julia made it her mission to make my life as difficult as possible. I don't even know what I did to earn her disdain. But from the first time we met, when I was just 12, she didn't like me. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just a kid trying to adjust to my father's new relationship, but for some reason, she treated me terribly whenever my dad wasn't around. She had this attitude problem and would be openly rude, which led me to start disliking her too. At the time, I didn't understand why an adult would act this way toward a child. I was always the responsible one, achieving good grades, being respectful, and generally well-behaved. I did my best to be polite to her despite her constant mistreatment. But after a while, I realized that no matter how nice I tried to be, she would never reciprocate. So I began responding in kind. If she was rude, I would make sure to respond sharply. If she criticized my appearance, I'd comment on hers or make remarks about her personality. This back and forth continued for years, but whenever my dad was around, it was only me who was scolded. He never said anything to Julia, and I was the only one ever reprimanded. There were even times when I was grounded for defending myself against her, despite her being the one who initiated the conflict. This dynamic left me feeling isolated and misunderstood in my own family, contributing to the strained relationships I have with them now. If I'm being honest, I often felt like my father wasn't really invested in me either. It seemed as though being a parent was more of an afterthought for him, a side project rather than a priority. As a child, I spent a lot of time alone, either with babysitters or my grandmother, who lived 2 streets over. My dad was hardly around, always seemingly consumed with work or other commitments, and even as I grew older, I struggled to connect with him. He rarely showed up for any of my events, like school plays or sports matches, and every absence left me feeling disappointed and invisible. Thankfully, I had my grandmother, who was my rock and did her best to be there for me at every opportunity. Losing her a few years into high school hit me hard. It felt like losing the only family I truly had because, by then, I was living with my dad and Julia, and it was a nightmare. To be honest, Julia had become even more unbearable after marrying my father. Now that she knew she wasn't going anywhere and that my dad would always put her first, she started targeting me more than ever. She would insult me, making all kinds of hurtful comments about my appearance or intelligence, and I was expected to just accept it quietly. Every time I tried to defend myself, to argue, or tell her to stop, my dad would reprimand me, saying I had no right to speak to her like that, as if defending myself was somehow an offense. After my grandmother passed away, things only got worse. Julia's remarks grew even more cruel and cutting. She would taunt me, telling me that now that I had no one to stand up for me, I was going to be miserable. And sadly, she was right. That made it even harder to bear, knowing she had some power over my emotional state. She told me that she would make sure my dad kicked me out before I even had a chance to ask him for help with college. She claimed she was going to take all of the money for herself and buy something nice, because in her words, that would be a better use of it than sending me to school. According to her, I was an idiot, so I didn't deserve it. That wasn't even remotely true. I was as straight a student, consistently at the top of my class, and I knew Julia was just trying to provoke me. But it always got under my skin, creating this awful cycle. She would say something cruel, I'd get angry, then I'd try to retaliate, and in the end, my dad would ground me. Even when I tried to warn him that she was just after his money, he didn't believe me. Instead, he accused me of being possessive and told me he didn't appreciate my antagonism towards his wife. It was maddening, and one day, I finally snapped. It had been about a year and a half since my grandmother's death, and Julia had been relentless with her remarks. One afternoon, I came home from school already feeling like the day had been terrible. Someone at lunch had accidentally spilled something on my clothes, ruining my favorite outfit. It wasn't intentional, but it still made my day worse. To make matters worse, I had a pounding headache from the stress of upcoming exams and was just fed up with how things were going. As soon as I walked in the door, Julia was there, ready with one of her usual snide comments, and I knew I couldn't take it anymore. When I walked in the door, I was hoping for some peace and quiet after a long day, but instead of leaving me alone, Julia, my stepsister, known for her sharp tongue, made some nasty comment. Though I don't remember the exact words, it was something typical of her, meant to rile me up or put me down. Before I knew it, fueled by frustration and anger, I found myself on top of her trying to throw punches. I guess the only advantage I had was that I caught her off guard. She wasn't expecting me to react that way, so I managed to pin her down for a brief moment. But as soon as she realized what was happening, the tables turned, and we ended up in a full-blown physical struggle, a chaotic mess of limbs and shouting. Once I left for college, everything changed. I was finally independent, free from the constant fear of Julia and my dad. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. I made a lot of great friends during my college years, and I'll always look back on that time as the best of my life. When the holidays came, I'd go back home, but I mostly kept to myself and stayed out of everyone's way. I didn't let Julia's negativity affect me, because I knew I only had to put up with her until it was time to leave again. That made all the difference, and it felt like I could finally live on my own terms. Looking back, I can admit that it was completely irrational and reckless to start a fight, especially knowing that she was much bigger and stronger than me. Having been an athlete in her school years, I was thin and scrawny at the time, barely weighing anything, and I had no chance of actually overpowering her. She eventually pushed me off, using her strength to her advantage, but I kept yelling, more out of defiance than anything else. Then she shoved me into a room, the storage closet to be exact, and locked me inside for hours. I didn't get out until my dad came home from work. She didn't even bother to call him earlier to inform him of what had happened. He came home at his usual time, around evening, so I must have been stuck in that room for 4 or 5 hours. The room was tiny and cramped, with only one narrow window that barely let in any light, and it was full of junk, old furniture, boxes, and things we rarely used. I remember banging on the door, my fist sore from the effort, begging her to let me out, promising I wouldn't fight her again. Ever. I'm claustrophobic, so being locked in that small, airless room felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But she ignored me completely, and I spent that time crying and pleading, but my cries fell on deaf ears, echoing in the cramped space. When my dad finally came home, they let me out, and both of them were clearly upset, their faces tight with anger and disappointment. My dad even told me that he might send me away and was threatening to call the authorities because of what had happened, his voice filled with a sternness I rarely heard. I was devastated and had no choice but to beg them not to take any action like that, promising that I wouldn't ever do something like this again, and that I would behave properly from then on. Julia, on the other hand, seemed to take a certain satisfaction in the situation, a smug look on her face, even though she was the one who had been attacked. But it gave her the perfect reason to make my life even harder. After that day, I had no choice but to keep my word and behave as best I could. Even when Julia would make cruel comments or try to provoke me, I learned to just bite my tongue and ignore it because I knew that speaking back would only lead to more trouble, and I wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences. I had bigger things to worry about, like making sure my dad would pay for my college tuition. I couldn't risk losing that because I didn't have anyone else who could help me financially. Sure, I had a few friends, but I wasn't about to beg them for money, and taking out a loan would still require my parents' involvement. That's why I chose to keep the peace and endure Julia's treatment, no matter how much it hurt. It was a tough position to be in, living in constant tension and walking on eggshells, but I kept reminding myself that I was only a few years away from leaving for college. Once I was out of there, I wouldn't have to face her anymore. Eventually, after high school, I left for college and everything I had worked for finally paid off. To my surprise, my dad agreed to pay for my education, something I knew Julia didn't want, but he saw it as an investment. He believed that if I became successful, he'd eventually get the money back. He knew I planned to study law, a dream I had harbored since childhood, and since lawyers make good money, he wasn't worried about me finding a job and repaying him someday. I promised I would pay him back, but thankfully, he never got it in writing. Without that, there was no way for him to enforce it, and I was free to do whatever I wanted, shaping my future on my own terms. After finishing college, I moved into an apartment with a few of my friends from university. It was an exciting time, filled with newfound independence and the thrill of starting a new chapter in life. Within just a few months, I landed a job at a reputable law firm, which I'm still working at today. We primarily handle family law cases, focusing on divorces, custody disputes, and similar issues, which can be challenging but also rewarding as we help families navigate difficult times. When she finished, she started heading out, but then she stumbled on the small set of stairs leading to the exit of the women's room. The stairs were narrow, just 5 steps, but that was enough for her to lose her balance. She nearly fell, but I caught her in time and stopped her from hitting the floor. I thought she would thank me, but instead, she started yelling at me, asking if I was out of my mind. I could tell immediately that she was exaggerating. I was standing right in front of her. There was no way I could have shoved her or caused her to trip, even if I wanted to. The look on her face told me this was all for show. She was trying to get attention, and it worked. Before I knew it, everyone at the party was staring at us. My dad knew about my work and had asked for my help in the past with some legal questions, but after what happened a couple of months ago, I'm not sure I would ever be willing to assist him again. Earlier this year, my dad and his partner, Julia, shared the news that she was expecting a baby. I was caught off guard at first, especially considering her age and the fact that she had chosen to keep the baby, given her previous stance on not wanting children. But in some ways, I thought it might be a good thing. Maybe my dad would become more involved in this child's life and find a renewed sense of purpose. I congratulated them both when they made the announcement and even attended the baby announcement party. I knew it was mostly for show, though. If I hadn't gone, it would have led to uncomfortable questions and unnecessary family drama, so I chose to attend and put on a brave face. Since I moved out, I haven't kept in regular contact with my dad or Julia. We exchange maybe 1 or 2 messages each month, but it's usually just out of obligation rather than genuine interest. I visit them during the holidays or for birthdays and other special occasions, as long as they extend an invitation to me. My dad will sometimes reach out to see how I'm doing, and I'll do the same for him. It's more of a routine than something we both genuinely desire. As for Julia, we don't communicate at all, and honestly, I'm fine with that. There's nothing I need to say to her, and I'm certain she doesn't have anything nice to say to me either. Anyway, at the pregnancy announcement party, I did the polite thing, congratulated them, and brought a thoughtful gift which I hoped would be useful for the baby. But Julia didn't thank me, nor did she even acknowledge me throughout the event. In a way, I was relieved. It meant she wouldn't be trying to provoke me or make any of her usual snide remarks, which have always been a source of tension between us. So the day passed without incident, and I managed to enjoy myself, catching up with a few extended family members I hadn't seen in a while. I got caught up with work soon after, as our firm was handling a particularly high-profile custody case, so I didn't visit them again until the baby shower. They had planned a big celebration, and by that time, I think Julia was well into her 3rd trimester. She looked very pregnant, waddling around the party with a noticeable glow. My dad was busy socializing with the guests, leaving Julia in need of someone to accompany her to the women's room. I happened to be sitting closest to her when she asked, and although I hesitated at first, I agreed to walk with her. I suggested she might prefer her mother or sister, who were both in attendance, but she specifically asked for me, and I wasn't about to turn down a pregnant woman. So I reluctantly agreed and walked with her to the restroom, making small talk along the way. My dad came rushing over looking visibly concerned. He asked what was going on and why she was shouting at me instead of calmly explaining the situation. He wanted to know what had actually happened, that she had tripped on the stairs and I had caught her just in time to prevent a nasty fall. But Julia had concocted a different story entirely. She loudly claimed that I had maliciously pushed her down the stairs, ensuring everyone around us heard her accusation. I was taken aback, utterly disbelieving what I was hearing. I desperately tried to defend myself, explaining to my dad that I hadn't done anything like what she was describing in a bid to clear my name. I even offered to have him check the security footage, though deep down, I knew the cameras didn't cover that particular area, leaving me without a shred of evidence. It was her word against mine, and I had a sinking feeling about how this would unfold. Deep down, I understood that my dad would always choose to believe Julia. When we met, my father appeared visibly upset about something, and after talking with him, I understood why. Apparently, he had started to doubt that the baby was really his shortly after Julia gave birth. True to form, my dad took her side. He immediately started yelling at me, calling me insane, and asserting that he should have kicked me out the day I allegedly attacked her. He expressed regret for allowing me to stay with them, insisting that he should have realized I was mentally unstable. His harsh words didn't stop there. He accused me of being envious of Julia, claiming she was everything I couldn't be, successful, beautiful, just better in every conceivable way. He said I was only trying to turn him against her out of jealousy, calling me a psycho. He demanded that I leave immediately and threatened to call the police if I dared to resist. The looks from everyone at the party were piercing and judgmental. It felt as though the entire room had turned against me, and I quickly realized that arguing was pointless. I was humiliated beyond belief, and there was no reason to prolong the confrontation. I quietly walked away without uttering another word, choking back tears of anger and betrayal. I knew my dad had already said enough to wound me deeply, and there was no point in sticking around to hear more. That was the last time I saw him. And since then, I've made no attempt to reach out or mend the shattered bonds. I blocked his number immediately and made a concerted effort to move on with my life. In fact, I've distanced myself from the rest of my family as well. I could only imagine what they must think of me now, and although the initial separation was painful, I realized I had emotionally disconnected from my dad long ago. Accepting the reality of the situation didn't take long. I haven't heard from him in months. And honestly, I never expected him to try to contact me again. But just last week, he called me from an unknown number. His voice was surprisingly calm as he said he needed my help. I couldn't fathom what he might require from me, but curiosity got the best of me, and despite everything, I agreed to meet him for lunch, wondering about the story he would tell this time. It was the baby's appearance that made him suspicious. The skin tone and features didn't match his or Julia's. The baby had a slightly darker complexion and didn't look Caucasian. Given that my dad and Julia were both white, it seemed unlikely they would have a baby with a different skin color. Julia spent several agonizing weeks trying to convince him that the baby was indeed his, but eventually she gave up the charade and admitted the truth. She realized it was pointless to keep lying. He had already figured it out and just needed confirmation from her. He started arguing with me during our lunch at the restaurant that day, accusing me of being ungrateful and calling me a brat. I found it incredibly unfair because, throughout my life, he had treated me terribly and never made any effort to build a relationship with me. He even went so far as to label me as mentally unstable and claimed I was just jealous of Julia. At that point, I had no reason to help him. The only reason he reached out to me was because he assumed I'd do something for him without charging. The revelation was that Julia had been seeing a coworker around the time she got pregnant. Neither of them expected the baby to be his because they had only been together a couple of times before the coworker moved away to another city, and they never saw each other again. Julia had assumed with confidence that the baby would be my father's, but when it became clear that wasn't the case, she could no longer keep up the lie. Once my dad learned the truth, he made the difficult decision to move out and began living separately from her. I was taken aback, as I had always thought they'd stick together no matter the challenges they faced. There were so many things that surprised me about this situation. I had never suspected her of cheating, though in retrospect, I couldn't say I was completely shocked. In hindsight, it made a painful kind of sense. People who are capable of being deceitful are often deceitful in more ways than one. My dad explained that after he left the house, Julia didn't even bother to reach out to him, not once. He had finally come to the realization that since she wasn't going to make an effort, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her anyway, the best thing was for them to move forward with a divorce. He admitted he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he was quite heartbroken, but he felt it was the only choice left for him. Their marriage, which seemed so solid from the outside, had crumbled beyond repair. I felt sorry for him. Truly I did, but at the same time, I didn't think any of this really had anything to do with me. I thought perhaps now he would finally apologize for all the years he treated me poorly, the years I spent yearning for a closer bond and try to make amends as a father. But I was wrong. He wasn't interested in apologizing. It became apparent that he was only reaching out to me because he expected me to help him with the legal matters of the divorce. For free. I don't even know why I thought for a second he'd want to make things right between us. That's just not who he is. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong, ever. So I told him I wouldn't do anything for him without payment. The best I could offer was to connect him with some of my colleagues in the legal field and have them assist him, but I wasn't going to handle it personally. I wasn't obligated to assist him, and even offering the connection was me going above and beyond. I didn't owe him that courtesy either. I simply didn't want to get entangled in this situation. I told him I wasn't willing to help and wished him luck, expecting him to understand my position. But his reaction was not what I expected. He actually got upset with me as if I had wronged him by setting up boundaries. Then he reminded me, quite pointedly, that he had paid for my education, implying that I owed him for it. It was as if he was keeping a ledger of every expense, and I couldn't let that slide. So, I calmly pointed out that he only decided to pay because he expected me to repay him eventually, treating it less like a generous favor and more like a calculated transaction in his mind. He essentially demanded my help without any offer of compensation, and I found the whole situation so absurd that I just laughed in his face and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him to stew in his own arrogance. Update. Well, things have taken a surprising turn. Apparently, my dad's divorce plans have been called off. About 2 weeks ago, he started the divorce process, but just now, my cousin reached out to let me know that they've decided to try and fix their marriage instead. They've canceled the proceedings and are now looking for a marriage counselor. But honestly, I couldn't stop laughing when I heard that because it's so unbelievable. I really can't picture any man with self-respect sticking with someone like that, but I guess my dad doesn't have much of that. I'm at least grateful my cousin is on my side because otherwise I'd be completely in the dark about what's happening with my family. It seems like I've become their favorite topic lately, with them constantly complaining about how ungrateful I am and how I treated my dad poorly. They say that no one deserves a daughter like me, especially my father. To be honest, I can't argue with that. They certainly don't deserve someone like me. Since that confrontation, my father and the rest of the family have been relentlessly pressuring me to reconcile with him. They keep trying to guilt-trip me into offering my assistance, laying the emotional manipulation on thick, and I feel utterly at a loss for how to handle their incessant demands. It's mentally and emotionally exhausting to deal with, day in and day out. Ada for refusing to help my father for free after he chose to sever ties with me and believe my stepmom instead. Update. I've come to the difficult decision to cut ties with my father and block all my relatives who continue to uphold this toxic dynamic. The situation was becoming unbearable, and they wouldn't relent in pushing me to help him. I finally told them in no uncertain terms that if they truly wanted to assist him, they should focus their efforts on finding him a competent lawyer instead of harassing me. Then I blocked everyone. I had maintained contact with them up until now because I felt they hadn't directly wronged me, at least not in a way that was immediately obvious, but the passive complicity they showed when I was a kid, enduring bullying without intervention, spoke volumes. No one said a word then. Yet now, with my father facing his own troubles, they all rushed to defend him. It's a blatant display of double standards, but honestly, I've washed my hands of the entire situation. I'm focusing on my work and my well-being, hoping they respect my wishes and stay out of my life from here on out. Update. I heard from my cousin, who I'm still on good terms with, that my father has filed for divorce and is in the process of hiring one of the top divorce lawyers in the country. I know it's going to be an incredibly expensive endeavor, and I honestly don't understand why he thought he could expect it all for free. He has the resources, but he was just too cheap to pay for it himself, instead scheming to use me to avoid spending a dime. He never offered an apology for his past actions, and he assumed I'd be willing to let him take advantage of me. Well, I earn my own living now, and I don't rely on him for anything, so I'm not about to become a doormat for his whims. In fact, I'm somewhat relieved that this is happening to him and Julia. After everything they've put me through, the lies, the manipulation, the emotional turmoil, they absolutely deserve the mess they're in. In fact, I'll say it loud and clear. They deserve each other. They've always been a perfect match in their shared selfishness. Update. It's been nearly a year since I last spoke to my dad, and during this time, I've had no contact with him whatsoever. As far as I'm aware, they've relocated and are raising their son with support from Julia and her family, who have always been a strong presence in their lives. They've moved to Missouri, where they are starting afresh, and honestly, I'm relieved they're far away from me. This distance has allowed me to focus on my own life without the constant emotional turmoil. On a brighter note, I'm thrilled to share that I recently received my first promotion at work. This achievement has been a significant milestone in my career, and things are really looking up for me professionally. I've managed to maintain contact with only one family member, my cousin, who has been a pillar of support throughout this journey. This connection has been invaluable, providing a sense of familial support that I once thought I had lost. In my personal life, I've started dating a wonderful guy from work. Things have been progressing well over the past 6 months, and we've had meaningful conversations about our future together. We're both on the same page about what we want, and it feels like this relationship could really turn into something special. For the first time in my life, I feel truly loved and appreciated by someone, and the happiness this brings is beyond words. Honestly, it feels like everything in my life began improving once my dad and Julia moved out of state. My career is thriving, I have a caring and supportive boyfriend, and I've surrounded myself with friends who genuinely care about my well-being. Although I don't have a traditional family anymore, having my cousin by my side is more than enough for me. I am in a good place right now, and I'm truly happy with where my life is headed. Life is good, and I am taking a moment to appreciate all the positive changes. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who's reached out to check on me and offer their support. It's truly remarkable how people who don't even know me personally can show more care and concern than my own family ever did. Your encouragement and kindness have meant the world to me, and I will never forget the impact your support has had on my journey to happiness. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart.